definitions of various sectors, whether it's the corporate sector, statutory sector, voluntary sector, and instead acknowledge that these days those boundaries or those definitions are somewhat blurred. And alongside that, we've introduced at SERVE a programme of activity which started out only in October, and we call it Happy to Serve, which I suppose you would argue that we're lucky in that sense that it's a play on our name. But the launch of Happy to Serve brought together initially just over, I think, 20 or so local businesses. And then we had a follow-up event. These are primarily networking events. We had a follow-up event only a few weeks ago in Wellingborough. The first one was in Rushden, and we had 34 people, I think, at the Wellingborough event. And in total, so far from those two events, we've started working with 9 local businesses. And I'll be happy to share with you some of the tactics that we've been employing. So just to give an overview of the workshop, and as Pratima says, at the end of this session, there's plenty of time to discuss any questions. And at the same time, if it's not covered any of the particular issues that you're interested in, then please say so. So to start with, I'll be discussing with you what I'm calling the corporate mindset. And that's, I would say to you, is probably one of the most important elements of this, in that it's about recognizing that to be taken seriously, that we speak a different language. And so I'll be going into that in a little bit of detail. Then looking at how we can identify prospects, and in doing that, the best ways of approaching them, looking at different ways of working with corporates, and above all, building our confidence as a sector and as individual organisations in how we approach and work with the corporate world. So let me start by just exploring with you, well, what is it that corporates want? And as I'm sure you'll appreciate, for lots of businesses, they will appreciate the value of having CSR and more recently ESG policies in place. At the same time, I think it's worth acknowledging that you'll probably find in larger corporates that they'll have a greater understanding of the importance of those policies, and in particular, how working with a charity will enhance those policies. From the point of view of the business itself, if they do have, let's talk about ESG policies in particular in place, which I'll come on to in a moment, it means that they can demonstrate to their staff that they're taking their environmental, social and governance responsibilities very seriously. At the same time, it, in most cases, should enable them to enhance their local impact. But most of all, for an organisation or a business that's got those sort of policies in place and starts to demonstrate that they're working with a charity, it will add enormous value to them. I mean, the simple differences are that CSR policies tended to be focused very much from an internal perspective, but ESG policies are more externally facing. And so for larger businesses who are looking for investors, certainly being able to demonstrate that they have those policies in place, but actually are implementing them, it will make them more attractive to those external investors. A really good website is British Business Bank Co. UK, where there's lots of further details about the evolution of CSR into what's more commonly known as ESG. But being more practical about it, it's not just about policies, and it's not just about an awareness of any PR value. I would put to you that one of the key questions that an organisation or a business is going to be thinking about, even if they don't voice it, is, well, what's in it for me? Why should I work with a charity? And there we need to recognise that we've got a world of opportunity. At the moment, as we know, there's all sorts of uncertainty around, and in particular in the business world. Businesses, as you know, are facing increased costs over the next week or so, with higher PAYE and national insurance contributions. Also, the increase in the minimum wage. The economy generally is one where there's a lot of gloom and doom. And certainly at any business networking event, you'll probably find that it's very much a discussion around how difficult things are. And indeed they are for lots and lots of businesses, irrespective of the size. But what I would put to you is that alongside this, there's more opportunities than ever before. Because one thing that we can add to a business is we can add a lot of value. And by that, what do I mean? Well, when we're looking at how we now at Serve approach business, the first thing we do is not talk about money. Now, you might think that's a bit counterintuitive, but our approach is through our Happy to Serve program to bring together businesses, talk to them in groups and individually about how, by working with a charity, we can tailor make a program of activity that will meet their aims. In other words, it's not about us, it's about them. And so the first thing I would say for us to think about is, let's think about the focus, and the focus is on the business we're talking to and not talking about ourselves. For those of you with a long memory, you may remember a conservationist years ago called David Bellamy. And David Bellamy spent a lot of time raising the profile of the environmental issues, and in particular the voluntary sector. And I had the pleasure of getting to know him quite well when I was a volunteer at the Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire Wildlife Trust, where he was the patron. And I recall very vividly that we were holding a corporate event where it was a networking event, and he spoke in order to raise the profile of the Wildlife Trust and to start to get businesses to help them become more aware of the environment. And in preparation for that, I asked him a very simple question. I said, so what's your overall approach when you're talking to corporates? And he said, well, for a start, he said, I won't hold out a begging bowl, as he put it. He said that he was more interested in talking to them as an equal. And that can be very difficult for us at times to remember that actually we are equals. It's not about the corporate world being more superior anyway. And so the approach that he adopted, and I saw it in action, was talking as an equal, demonstrating that we are every much as valid as a business is. And that's even more so the case these days. So what I would suggest is that we need to think about how we speak the language of the business community. I was presenting this workshop earlier today, and we went around the room and asked, so how many of us in the voluntary sector use acronyms and jargon? And you can imagine, I'm sure, that there were a lot of examples of that. If you approach a corporate, I think one of the most important things to think about is the language we use. A business isn't going to be particularly interested in what we have to say and the language we use. And I would ask you to think about how you translate that into corporate speak as opposed to charity speak. I'll give you just a couple of examples. For example, we talk about surplus and deficit, and a business is going to talk about profit and loss. We will also talk about outcomes. You probably find a business is going to be talking about outputs. In terms of added value, then a business will think about what I would call features and benefits. So in other words, the features are what the business does and products and services that they sell, and we will talk about outcomes. Alongside this, let's not forget that from a business point of view, in terms of what I said earlier about trying to change the conversation, we're all operating in the same community. At Serve, for example, we offer services and provide services to hundreds and hundreds of families and individuals throughout the county. And as I said at the Wellingborough event that we hosted very recently, a lot of those businesses present are selling their products and services to the same people, to the same families. And so when talking about what is a community, I would ask you to consider these days a community is not necessarily how it was defined 10, 20 years ago. And that these days, if we're talking as a local charity to local businesses, that we actually all share the same community. And again, that's what I mean about changing the conversation. So let's think about how we can reframe the value that we can offer a business. And again, not just in terms of what we do, but what the benefits are to that business, and to focus on the outcomes, but not necessarily just the outcomes that we're proud of, but what outcomes we could offer a business working alongside us. There's also the issue of how do we decide which business to approach and which business we'd like to work with. And to that extent, I would ask you to just think about brand. A business is going to be very protective of its brand and how it's perceived in a local community. From our point of view, we also need to remember that if we want to work alongside a business and have them work with us, that they need to have confidence that our brand has got a lot of positive values attached to it. And so from that point of view, let's think about what is said about us on social media, how we're viewed in terms of how our services are delivered, because what we're asking a business to do is to put their brand alongside ours. And one of the great attractions will be how we can add value because of the work that we do. So it's, if you like, it's a positive approach based on brand association. And also, of course, with lots of businesses who may be struggling, who may be in a very competitive environment, they've got to think about how they can keep their staff motivated. And so if we can say, look, we can enhance your staff morale, then that will prove very attractive. I'm going to give you a few examples in a second. So if we think about who are we approaching, I'd ask you to consider for a moment the different ways of finding prospects. This afternoon, I spoke to a group and we were talking about the difference between approaching local businesses as opposed to national businesses. And I'd suggest to you that it's about finding a match. It's about looking on social media, looking at advertising which is carried out by a business, and decide if you feel that they're operating at a similar level to you. In other words, if yours is a local charity and it's working in a very small geographical area, are you going to be attractive enough to a national business who perhaps are operating across the country? I'm a great advocate of actually trying to find those matches, and then let's look at how we can make a targeted approach, a more focused approach, rather than a scattergun approach. And so I would encourage us to look at what businesses are doing, and if we want to be seen to be operating locally, to find those businesses who are on LinkedIn and talking about what they're doing in the locality, to look at Companies House and do our research on who they are, what they do, how big they are, and to consider then how we interact with businesses at networking events such as Chamber of Commerce and so on. This is where we did have quite a discussion this afternoon about the language that we use, and I come back to this again and again. If you're not comfortable talking in a business environment, then I would encourage us to look at who within our organisation is, because what I would suggest is it's about the confidence that we demonstrate, that we are proud of what we do, and we need to get the attention of a business by showing that we're confident in what we do and what we can offer them. So what I would suggest is think about who we are try and look at businesses who we think there's going to be a match with, whether they're already demonstrating, for example, any CSR-based or ESG-based activity. And then let's consider how we promote ourselves, and in particular, how we promote ourselves to the decision makers. And the decision makers in a business could be quite varied depending on the size of it. It could be a business owner, or it could be a company director, because ultimately we need to be able to spend our time as profitably as possible, and obviously as focused as possible. And before I go on, are there any questions at this stage? No? I'll carry on. Okay. So how do we make the approach? Email or phone is fine, networking events. But I would suggest to you the first thing to think about is what you're going to say if you contact a business for the first time. And again, this is counterintuitive, but I would encourage you to think about not asking for money. Because if you contact a business for the first time and they've never heard of you, or they may have heard a little bit about you, and the first thing that you say is, we need some money for this, then it's probably going to be quite an uphill task. And instead, I would ask us to consider the importance of building relationships, and then the money will flow. And so in making an approach, it's about being succinct, being positive, being confident, and talk about how we can add value to a business and their particular brand. And in terms of how we can then demonstrate value, it's the equivalent of saying that we can become a promotional partner with them, because it's about them and not us. And that might seem counterintuitive, but it does work. So what I would suggest is we've got to think about how we address the question that a business is going to ask, and that is, well, what's in it for me? And so it's important that we don't waffle, and that we have the equivalent of a one-page document that we will have ingrained in our minds at all time. And that is who we are, what our mission is, what we do, what sort of impact we're having in the community, the different ways that a business can support us, and obviously our contact details. You'll find on the Serve website, which is serve.org.uk, that we've shown 50 ways, 50 ways in which a business can work with us. It's not just about funding. It's about encouraging a business to get its staff involved in fundraising events. It's about goods in kind. It's about services in kind. It's about lots of different types of ways in which we can work with the corporate. And once we get started, then we can build. And it's surprising, and I've found this over the years, and in particular even in the past year, that by offering a menu of options, it means that you can start to build that relationship that will lead to a business actually then offering you money, rather than just saying we need some funding from day one. So how we do that, it's about that single page document that says who we are, what we're doing, and what impact we can have. Because if we can show what impact we're having, then we can share that with a business supporter. Now, on the back of that, and you might like to think about this, I'm sure you've heard of the old adage about having an elevator pitch. And we tried this afternoon. I'd ask you to think about it as well. And that is, if you were to meet someone, say at a networking event, can you say within a minute and a half or 2 minutes who you are, what impact you're having in the community, and what's in it for the business? And it's really hard to be that succinct, but it's about demonstrating that you can be succinct, because just as you're going to be trying to build a relationship with a business, so too will other charities as well. And in fact, of those I mentioned who are now working with us at Serve in the past year, I think in three cases, yeah, they are working with other charities, which is great. it's not about exclusivity. It's about recognizing that some organizations, some businesses will do that. But to start that conversation, it's about being able to get someone's attention quickly and succinctly. And you might want to think about that single page document and how you translate that into the elevator pitch, as it was once known. So, what types of partnership are we going to be looking for? Charity of the Year means lots of different things to different businesses, but it can manifest itself in different ways, from the type of activities I've already touched on. And I would suggest to you that, again, it's not about saying this is what we want from you as your Charity of the Year, but actually giving the business that you're talking to the opportunity to talk about what's important to them, and then to tailor what a Charity of the Year activity looks like. And, lots of organizations, lots of businesses these days will encourage and support their staff to work as volunteers, and will often give them time off to do that. Others will say, well, they may be happy to sponsor an event or have their logo shown on social media or on a website. As I say, it's a case of just being flexible in terms of just encouraging a connection in the first place. Employee fundraising I've already touched on, and volunteering. Volunteering, I think, is increasingly an opportunity that we should think about as a sector, because, as we know, it's really difficult recruiting and retaining volunteers. But the corporate sector is one where, if it's a successful relationship, then encouraging their staff to spend time as volunteers is effective. Sponsorship speaks for itself, and I think that takes us into where you're asking someone to commit to some sort of financial outlay. Ask yourself, where are they going to be getting their budget from? And so a lot of sponsorship of, say, materials or events will probably come from a marketing budget. And there's nothing wrong with that, because, again, it means that you're able to demonstrate that you could work with a marketing team, and from the business point of view, they're clear on where they're going to be funding it from. And of course, there's payroll giving, which actually doesn't have a direct cost to the business. It's actually something which speaks for itself and comes from their staff. But payroll giving is something that, if you want to look at how the mechanics of it work, I'd encourage you to go on the HMRC website. So, in terms of relationship building, there are two things I would say are really important. First of all, let the business you're talking to, let the corporate you're talking to, decide who within your organization they feel most comfortable with, and they will decide. They might think that they want to deal with a particular individual or someone in a particular position, and so you end up with, in business terms, with the equivalent of account managers within your organization. And that's where then it's about building that relationship with them. And as activities take place, or as the relationship builds, you can never say thank you enough. And we've in the past year at Serve, we've started working with one very large organisation who had some bad experiences with other charities in the county, and the most common criticism they had was that they'd done a lot in terms of encouraging staff to work as volunteers, sponsored events, provide a lot of goods in kind, and they said that they were thanked once and that was it. So you can never really say thank you enough, and maintain that ongoing contact. Let them see what you're doing for them rather than what they're doing for you. So it's about having the confidence to do all this. It's about being clear on what we have to offer. And I would say it's about persistence, but polite persistence, as I've called it. For those of you that have been involved in corporate relationships or fundraising generally, you'll know that it is about persistence. It's also about being resilient, because you've got to get used to no far more than yes. But at the same time, if you approach it along the lines that I've just been discussing and look at it from the point of view of building relationships rather than simply asking for money, then that persistence will pay off. So in terms of what to do, I would suggest that think about 3 businesses that you know of, do your research, plan the best way to contact them, which could be through a networking event, it could be a direct contact. But again, I'd encourage you to think about, say, an introductory email or even print-based letter. Just explain who you are, but don't ask for money immediately. You might think, well, that is counterintuitive, but it will work by building the relationship first. And think about, of course, the resources that you need in order to do all this. Now, I'm going to just pause for a second and just say the Charity Commission have some great guidance for the voluntary sector, for charities, when working with what they call non-charities, which is primarily corporates. And I'd encourage you just to have a look at that, because it's really helpful.